All right, we're going to 30 inches first, checking our RPM.
7 lakes, Lockheed's departing south, 7 lakes. All right, minus rate, gear up.
Coming up.
Gear's coming up.
Nose coming over.
All right, fuel pumps are off. After takeoff, checklist is all complete.
Most of my Beech 18 landings, I never had the tail wheel lock. The tail wheel going around is not going to cause the airplane to lurch.
The tail wheel needs to be locked. You got to have good operational brakes and a locked tail wheel to prevent the aircraft from ground looping.
The purpose of me flying with Glenn in the Lockheed Electra, all I was trying to do, confirm that the flaps were up and the flap indicator was showing up.
I want you to confirm the flaps are up and indicating, right?
Besides that, it was coming out of maintenance.
Right now we're getting the brake line taken loose.
Brakes were disconnected to get to the oleo strut. We did the checklist perfectly, immaculately. The tail wheel was locked. I'll show you a picture of that right here. Here's the far right silver knob with the circle around it here in red. Tail wheel was engaged for this thing.
This is going to be our first problem, the silver knob floating above letters in a yellow circle. It's a jigsaw puzzle, 8 letters long, blank, blank, L-E-A-S-E-D. A 2-letter prefix to go along with least, released. That's a knob for the tail wheel lock. If you had a chance to whip around in a sparkling antique from the golden era of aviation, what would you do? A little background first. 2 days prior to November 2072 splitting its nose, a nearly identical Lockheed Electra Junior returned to Earth in an unsurvivable nose-down attitude. The flight had originated out of Chino Airport in California on June 15th. The purpose had been to prepare for a formation flight for a Father's Day event. The flaps had been fully extended for the pre-flight inspection. Ground crews attempted to convey that the flaps were still extended as the aircraft began taxiing to the runway. November 9-3 Romeo was observed taking off with the flaps fully extended. Soon after lifting off, the Electra Junior pitched up, the left wing dipped, and the 2 occupants spun into a fiery grave. God bless them. There's some question about the purpose of Dan and Glenn's flight 2 days later. Antique aircraft don't crash all that often, and when fatalities are involved, it gets the attention of the aviation community. It's the sort of thing that has the effect of clickbait without actually being clickbait. People are interested in the unusual, especially when it involves tragedy.
With the tail wheel lock, I don't even look at it because it's not a part of my deal. On the Beech 18 and the Lockheed, I prefer it to be unlocked.
Everything looks good until right there. See that tail wheel? Did you see that tail wheel spin around? That tail wheel was not locked.
This is our second problem. It's a little more complex. 1930s feeder airliners like the Lockheed Junior didn't come with an awful lot of manufacturer guidance. But in the case of the Lockheed 12A, the manufacturer did have something to say about the optional tail wheel lock. It was unambiguous. It should be locked for takeoff, landing, and taxiing straight ahead for any appreciable distance.
We've got developing news out of Chino tonight. Officials there are still searching for some answers after a World War II-era plane crashed shortly after takeoff from the Chino airport. Both of the people on board that twin-engine plane were killed.
They had just taken off in the vintage Lockheed 12A when something went wrong.
The plane started listing to the left, very sharp.
Witnesses say the plane was barely 300 feet in the air when it crashed to the ground.
This was central to the purpose of the ill-fated flight. Dan believed that the Chino crash was a result of excessive flaps during the takeoff attempt. This explains his focus on the flap setting just prior to takeoff. It also explains a somewhat erratic flight path that was stitched into the satellite data via ADS-B.
In light of the recent Lockheed crash, those guys, they never retracted their flaps. They missed it on their before takeoff checklist.
This airplane will definitely climb full flap. You gained a lot of altitude with full flap there. Flaps are coming up.
With 450 horsepower per side, it's not a surprise that the thing could outclimb the drag that the flaps produced, but that didn't mean it was without peril. This video footage, released soon afterwards by Dan on his channel Probable Cause, revealed a hidden nugget. The lever that controls the tailwheel lock was in the unlocked position. That the tailwheel was unlocked is confirmed by footage of November 2072 landing just prior to departing the runway. Interestingly, among the crumpled wreckage, the NTSB found the tailwheel lock handle in the locked position the next day. A quick briefing on tailwheel locks. They're designed to resist the tendency of tail draggers to ground loop. When locked, the tailwheel resists rotation, which is good for takeoff, landing, and taxiing straight ahead. But it's bad for turning, which you've got to do when you enter a runway. That's why it's one of the last things a pilot will do prior to applying takeoff thrust. Video footage from the takeoff and initial climb leaves little doubt that the lock lever was in the unlocked position. It was caught on video by Dan himself prior to Glenn pushing the throttles forward, and once again during climb out.
We did the checklist perfectly, immaculately. The tail wheel was locked.
In the video I showed, I thought it was in the locked position, and then I went back and looked. I can't tell if the position that I showed was actually unlocked. Now that I go back and think about it, I don't actually know which way it was in. I guess that just goes to show you how little I cared about it.
Dan's objection isn't unique. There's a bit of debate in the tail dragger community regarding the use of these locks. Still, the ancient L12A manual from Lockheed instructs pilots to lock the tail wheel for takeoff and landing. There's an obvious caveat to this. The tail wheel lock was an option in the Electra Junior. If it wasn't installed, every departure and arrival would be in the same configuration as it was on Dan and Glenn's flight.
All right, fuel pumps are on, mixtures and props are full. At control, tail wheel to go.
Tail wheel to go, the last item on the checklist. You have to wait until the aircraft is straight before you lock it.
Tail wheel is locked.
Notice his arm extending downward, pushing the lever from released into locked. Here's another angle after taking off. The tail wheel lever in the down position. Here's another angle during an approach. The handle remains in the down, locked position. Finally, another takeoff on another day.
I like it. Let's take a look at this flap indicator, which is right here. This flap indicator moves in and out.
And I just want to be on record saying that Dan picked the hottest day of the year so far to do this.
During taxi out, we had good brakes, and I helped him hold the brakes, both of them, during the run-up. You know, it takes a lot of leg pressure to hold that thing. So I had my toes up on top of both pedals, and they were both equally rock hard. After gear retraction, something changed.
The NTSB discovered a loose nut connecting the hydraulic brake line to the right brake assembly. They also discovered brake fluid on the right gear and strut, a strong indication that a loss of brake pressure occurred on the right brake due to depressurization of brake fluid, a result of the leak.
And the next thing I knew, Glenn goes, "What?" And I looked up and I saw we were leaving the runway.
There's some debate within the tail dragger community as to the value of tail wheel locks. As it is, not all tail wheel aircraft have a lock installed. The devices come with a trade-off. Locked tail wheels provide stability, preventing the aircraft from inadvertently swerving, but that stability also decreases maneuverability during taxi. This causes some pilots to eschew the tail wheel lock altogether, or for landing in particular, due to the need to taxi clear of the runway immediately after landing. In Glenn's case, his videos make it clear that he was aligned with manufacturer guidance. He landed with the tail wheel locked and immediately unlocked it following the deceleration to taxi speed. Manufacturer instructions encourage a slightly fast landing speed to land on the main wheels first, which Glenn satisfactorily accomplished. For obvious reasons, you can't apply brakes until the tail wheel has touched down. Between the flare, main's first touchdown, and waiting to decelerate to lower the tail wheel to prevent lifting off again, you're going to eat up quite a bit of runway. Brakes are a necessity, not an option here. If one brake has failed, particularly if the tail wheel is freecastering, a turn opposite the failed brake is a guarantee. The conditions of the tail wheel lock is relevant, but it's also easy to overstate its impact. Ignore the tail wheel here and focus on the rudder. Glenn almost immediately applied right rudder, and as the aircraft swerved to the left, he rapidly applied full right rudder. Likely at the same time, he applied full right brake and released the left brake. Things happen fast. In retrospect, once directional control had been lost, hammering the left brake would have whipped the aircraft around and possibly prevented collision with the trees. But the edge of the runway is precariously close to hangars. Glenn's snap decision was likely that collision with foliage presented a better option than destroying a neighbor's hangar. You've got to trust the pilot in command's judgment on this one. The mechanical failure of the right brake would have been more than enough to cause the crash. The tail wheel should have been locked, and it's clear that this was Glenn's intention during landing. But with the failed right brake, it wasn't going to provide the stability to keep him on the grass runway. It seems unlikely that the brake wasn't functioning properly during the initial taxi for takeoff, unless, like a NASCAR champion, all turns were to the left, no correction to the right needed. If this were the case, the stabilizing effect of the tail wheel lock might have perhaps prevented the accident. It would have, at least, given Glenn a little more time to figure out the mismatch that existed between the brakes, a mismatch that would not have been apparent during low-speed taxi prior to flight.
This failed landing happened in Butts County. The plane went off the runway and crashed into a tree. We just checked. Everyone on board was flown by medical helicopter to local hospitals. We know this is a twin-engine Lockheed plane. It's still intact, but wedged under a tree.
Like the Secret Service staring at building tops in a field in the middle of Pennsylvania, tragedies are often presaged by the failure to properly mitigate threats. In the case of the accident flight, the occupants of both pilot seats were distracted by filming for YouTube content. It was also hot, a Georgia evening in the thick of June. Previous videos of Glenn depict a certain flow that he utilized to accompany the before takeoff checklist. He would close the side window, run the items, leaving the tail wheel locked to go.
Mixtures, props are full. Fuel pumps are on. Get out here and get the tail wheel, and we'll be ready to rock and roll.
We came back into land and everything was normal. Speed's good, checklist complete, green lights, everything's good. It was a very nice landing. We started that hard left-hand turn. It womped over to a very hard left-hand turn. The left engine shut down. The right engine, when it hit, it broke cables and that engine went to almost wide open.
I don't really want to close my window though. This is in, the flaps are up, and the indicator's over here.
All right, we've already done a brief. The before takeoff checklist is all complete.
Here's to a speedy recovery for Glenn and Dan. Also in the comments are links to Glenn's YouTube page, which include multiple videos on the accident aircraft, as well as Dan's YouTube page, where you can find links to donate to his recovery fund. Stay safe. Until next time.